Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session of Zymposium. And on our current series, we're still exploring building better open source. So for the past two sessions, we've been working on bringing a new feature to an open source library called ZOHTTP, which is the ability for users to decide how to translate codec errors, which occur when something has the wrong shape or the wrong type, bad JSON, into custom response bodies. And today we're going to be working on, I don't know what. Let's find out. Do we have any volunteers for today's session? Oh, chat is off. My bad. Let's see if we can get chat turned on. It doesn't help that I don't know my way around this Zoom interface. Yeah, I have no idea how to turn chat on. I thought it was on because there's no button. How about this? Can folks ask, wait a minute. Oh, there we go. Never mind, I found it. Ta-da, chat is back on. All right, to resume, do we have any volunteers for today's session? What are we gonna take a look at today? This could be an existing open source project that you want to contribute to, or it could be an idea for a new open source project. All right, so Baldwin is volunteering to share some ideas for new open source projects. So why don't we go ahead and promote to panelist. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hey, yes, I can. Baldwin, welcome to Building Better Open Source. So you have some ideas for open source projects that you're interested in sharing. And I
That's right.
believe we briefly spoke about this, right? Are they the same ideas?
Yes, I
Okay,
narrowed them a
fantastic.
bit down, but yeah.
All right, so pitch me your ideas.
Okay, so currently there are two options, I think. One would be a .env library for the CO ecosystem.
Okay,
So,
yeah,
and the other one would be a approval test library or golden standard library or whatever you want to call it.
yeah.
And
Oh,
yeah, I think I'm equally interested in both projects, so I'm not too sure where to start and like to hear your ideas. And
yeah. So I think both of them could be an interesting fit for the ZO ecosystem. And the reason is ZO being a framework expects you to do things a certain way, to use the ZO effect type to describe your programs and so forth. And so having easy, ready-made integration for either golden testing or for .env support could make a lot of sense. Personally, I think, we could go either way on that. I think either of them could be really interesting. I know a number of people who have requested support for golden testing before in ZO test. And someone even tried to add this feature in some fashion or another. I don't know how successful that was or if it still works, but I know it has been requested and there's definitely demand for that. On the other hand, .env sounds simpler than golden
that's right.
testing. So take your pick and we can talk more about how we're gonna develop this. Nabil asked a question, which is great maybe to explain for our audience. What is golden testing?
Yeah, yeah, that's probably the best starting point. So yeah, there are different names for that. Golden testing, approval testing. In front-end land, it's normally called snapshot testing. And the idea is that instead of writing assertions by hand, you would have some code doing something, and then that creates an artifact which is written to disk to typically to the repository checked in. And then whenever the test runs again, it just makes sure that it produces the same artifact again. Typically, you would want this to produce text so you can actually manually approve whatever changes when something in the code changes. With binary, it's probably a bit harder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation of golden testing. Okay, so which one of these would you like to pick? We can start exploring that idea today, or we can put it to a vote to the audience, I suppose. If you can't choose, we can let them choose.
I mean, if you have heard that there is people interested in in golden testing, then that would probably be the more reasonable pick. But if the
Yeah.
audience has strong opinions on that, then
Okay. Golden testing is our default. Does anyone have a strong reason for wanting .env for Zio? Okay. It sounds like mostly we are on track to building golden testing for the Zio community. Okay. So do you have a maybe Google Doc or text file or something we could start to put notes to talk about what this project is and to figure out for our own purposes what it exists and what the MVP of this open source project should be?
I can share
Just an
my screen if
ordinary
you want.
empty text file will work, or it could be a Google Doc if you want me to collaborate on it in real time.
I think we can just do a text file because I have also drafted out some ideas that we can maybe have a look at later. So that
Fantastic.
probably makes sense. Now I have to figure out how to share my screen.
Nabil asks, would that be standalone or a part of Zio test? I think that's one of the things we need to figure out is, do we want a standalone golden testing library that is maybe compatible with Zio test, or do we want to add a golden testing feature to the existing Zio test? All right, so you got a blank notes here. So what I like to do when I'm starting a new open source library is think about a few different things. Obviously, one of which is, what do you call it, in the Zio ecosystem is pretty easy because there's no creativity required. It's like, Zio test, right? And it's Zio HTTP and it's Zio this and Zio that. So obviously this would be Zio golden testing. or if it's added to Zio test, then it could be it would just be a feature inside Zio test. But another, I think, important thing is to think about how we can describe and sell this library to developers. So how would you describe and sell this library? It doesn't exist now, but let's pretend it does exist and it does everything you want it to do. How would you describe and sell this library to developers?
So the typical advantage I see is twofold. One is that you don't have to write assertions by hand. I think that could be a catchphrase. And the other one is that it makes, especially dealing with legacy code, a lot easier because sometimes there it's really hard to write reasonable assertions. And so,
Yes. Okay, that makes sense. So maybe we could say something like Zio Golden Testing is a library. Oh, there you go. Copilot is helping us. Um,
I'm
and,
good
and
at
that's not what I
advertising
was
here.
thinking. I was not thinking along those lines. A library that, because what we want to state here is that if you have test results, right? Test results that are known to be good, then you can turn those into automated tests, right? That's basically the idea behind golden testing is you have a bunch of test result data that you know to be good. No, because sometimes there's a mistake, but anyway, for legacy testing, it doesn't matter because you're just talking about preserving functionality. So maybe we describe it like that. Zio Golden Testing is a library that lets you turn large quantities or large amounts of test results that are known to be correct, or maybe just say correct test. I don't know. Correct. I don't know. Test results that are known to be good. We can improve this later. This is our first pitch. It doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah, approved test results. I like that. Into automated tests that maybe that can be used to easily detect regressions, because this is a lot where golden testing is used. It's in identifying regressions. Okay, good. So that's our high level pitch. It's like this library lets you turn all this approved test result data into automated tests so you can prevent future software regressions, right? We might want to say one more word about the Zio part of this, because this is just not like Scala golden testing. This is Zio golden testing. So we might want to add another sentence here that says something like, Zio Golden testing is fully integrated into Zio Test, something like that. So you can use it alongside your existing Zio Test, Zio applications and Zio Test suites or something like that. Okay.
Sounds good.
So this library, or rather this description here, is giving us a goal to aim for. It's also helping us shape all the documentation and even the user interface or the developer interface that we end up building can be shaped by this goal. We're fundamentally we're building a library to turn approved test result data into automated tests. One of the things we can do is emphasize a bit more to the developer why they should want to use this library. And that's going to help us make sure we have the right feature set, right? So let's make a bullet point list that really like oversell, maybe not oversells, but really hammers home why you want to use this library, right? This is an amazing library. You want to use it. Why do you want to use it? And this is going to help us think about the actual concrete pains that this library is solving, that if this library didn't exist, we would have to solve on our own. So what's one of these pains, do you think?
Mm.
You stated one earlier, and I liked it, was something like you don't have to write your own assertions, right? You don't have to
Yeah,
manually think up. I like that. So we can write something like um, yeah, your own assertions. Okay, I like that. What else?
can also be very handy when you have long test results, like long JSON output or lists or something like that, because you really don't want to waste
Yes,
20 lines of code on expected results and then just make sure that it's equal.
that's right. So how would we phrase this? Maybe
So
can easily handle large test results, something like that. Yeah, maybe even just say that second part, right? The expected output. We don't even need to say the first part. It's just the success the successful test data does not live in code. Okay, and then maybe our third bullet point list, I think three is about right when you're pitching a library would be something like you don't have to wrap anything to use this inside Zio or to use it with Zio. This is the Zio specific pitch point. This is why you should use this library. The first two are why you should use any library for golden testing. The third one is why you should use this specific library for Zio testing. Yeah, I like this. All right. Do we have any feedback from the audience? Does this seem clear? Does anyone have any suggestions for how we could improve this pitch? All right. While audience is thinking, let's you and I think about the developer experience of this library. So imagine someone adds this to their test dependencies. They're already using Zio test and they open up some test suite. Their goal is to add golden tests to this test suite. What does that look like? They're in the code base. And let's type that now. So let's make an example here. So make a header here called example. And we're going to put, this is going to be our hello world. And it is a way of further selling this library because we're selling a library. Our audience is developers. Developers want to see code. They want to see how easy is this? Can I understand this? Does this seem like something I could be up and running with in a few minutes? And so we want to sell them in this code snippet here. We want to show them what it's like to use the library, give them a feel for it, and also convince them that yes, this is the best library for golden testing if you happen to be in the Zio ecosystem. So what does this look like?
yeah, I already started drafting that a little bit, so maybe I can just show you and
Okay.
you tell me what you think.
Yeah.
So typically what you see in libraries out there is that there is some kind of verify function that just takes whatever you put in and then knows where the artifact lives.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, that should be all you have to do, ideally. And then I suspect we would have to do some kind of magic to make it know what the artifact is. Ideally, it would have something to do with the suite and the test description.
Yes, right.
So, and then I guess there are different kinds of things you may want to do. Like you can have just text, or you could want to serialize something as JSON, maybe. Or maybe
Yes,
you could even provide some kind of codec if you have an ugly object that cannot easily be serialized, then you just, yeah, wouldn't even need to be a codec, just something to turn it into a string or whatever.
that's right. So I really do see how this could benefit from like what you're calling an approval test here. It could benefit from being able to take advantage of the suite name and the test name and so forth. Basically, the complete path to that, because that could be used to maybe organize these data files. I think we might have to give up on that for now because I'm not sure if that's possible, um, or even how to do it if it is possible. I think there might be a way to do that using fiber refs. I think that information might actually be stored in a fiber ref somewhere, but I'm not 100% sure. So that could be a nice to have, right? As a nice to have, we somehow take advantage of the suite name, etc., to allow a user to better organize their, and what would be the correct sort of accepted terminology for the data here for your golden test? Just golden
Uh,
data, maybe?
Maybe I don't. I mean, there are, as I mentioned, several names for these things, so I think we can just name it
Yeah.
whatever we find reasonable. And so, yeah, what now I'm remembering what I typed up last week. Um, so here I even added the some kind of name for the artifact
Yeah.
because
Yes.
I wasn't sure if it would be possible to yeah to deduct that from the suite and the test.
Yes. So I think we should start with this, and then later on we can figure out if there's a way to be more clever. But also, sometimes cleverness can be a bad thing because if you change the name of a suite, do you expect your test to break because
That's a good point.
it was referencing some test data that was stored in a directory that was inferred by the name of the suite. So sometimes magic can be too much, and predictability and consistency and just doing the dumb thing like here, if this text file is always stored in the same place, like in the resources directory, of the test configuration, then a user is going to know where to go to find to it, and they can refactor the suite all they want. They can move this stuff around. They can move this test to a different suite and nothing changes, nothing breaks, it keeps on working. So that could be useful. All right, Nabil, excuse me. Nabil has a point maybe that we can add to our pitch for this library, which is asserts final results instead of temporary results. And I know what he's getting at there. It's the fact that when you golden test, you don't care about all the intermediate steps. You're only looking at the final result. And that could be very nice for certain types of testing. It's like when you build a compiler, do you want to test the parsing and then the type inference and the type checking and everything, or do you just want to test the generated code? It's nice to test the results only. That way you can change any of the implementation details without breaking your test. Um, so this could be phrased as almost like test for final results, not intermediate values. Or no, even thinking about it at a higher level, like what's the practical benefit? You know, change your implementation code without breaking your tests, right? It lets you change how your code does what it does without breaking the tests. It is testing for output, not intermediate results.
Should we leave it like that? Or?
Sure. Yeah. And then Scott mentions two nice to haves. When you add a new test, your testing framework can generate the missing golden file from the current output of the function.
Yes, I agree. I didn't mention that, but I was kind of envisioning that as well because that's typically what these frameworks do. What
Yeah.
I'm personally unsure about is when it's not there or when it doesn't fit, would it still output it? And you just basically see it in the Git diff, what has happened? Or would it, what you sometimes see is something with a, um, yeah, something like output.txt dot unverified or something like that, and then you have to remove that,
Yeah.
or you have a dot approved in between that it doesn't add automatically. So you actually have to take this manual step to approve it and don't just accidentally git committed and then you don't see a diff and you don't know that you broke something.
Yeah. So that's a sort of usability and workflow question, which is how does a user interact with this? We know we want the ability to generate this artifact if it's missing, but do we generate it in to the final file name that the user specified, relying on them to add it to Git and commit it? Or do we generate using a different file name just for added visibility into the fact that it didn't exist before?
I mean, ideally, probably have tooling to help you with that. So it would create a different tool and then just ask you if you approve of that. But that
Yes,
opens another can of worm and can't be the concern of that library. So
right. Yeah. Nabil says, would you generate an output file when the test fails so you can compare the expected and actual output? I think that's important, right? And also, it's important to probably do that diff ourselves, ideally. So I'm thinking that it could be nice. First off, is it important that we expose in this sort of mock API that you have here? Is it important that we expose the difference between .text and .json,
I
or
mean,
does it matter to the user what result this is stored in, or what format this is stored in? Other than the fact that it should be obviously easy to inspect for debugging purposes.
so my guess would be that it could be a nice to have. I guess text is the default and everything else would need to be specified, but then maybe with .json we can make sure that it actually has the JSON encoder provided for whatever you pass in and give you a compiler error if not. So whereas yeah, otherwise you're gonna have to manually encode it in, as JSON if you have a case class.
We could potentially use Zio schema and say if there is a Zio schema for something, then you can use approval testing with it, and we will use that schema to serialize it into JSON or whatever else you like, and deserialize it as well if that's useful at some point.
Mm.
Does that seem, because what the situation I want to avoid, a user, I think, will want to work with their domain entities,
Mm.
like user and whatnot. They won't necessarily want to work with JSON. So if we force them to convert things to JSON, then it's just one extra step in the process, and we're making them do some busy work that's not really relevant to the problem that they're trying to solve. Would you agree, or could the actual way that it's represented in JSON matter a lot to the user for other reasons?
Unlikely. Maybe there are some cases where it's nice to be sure that it's JSON. Like when you're testing an API, you would expect to be able to get the output as JSON like you got it and then also verify it as that. But I mean, if we can find a good serialization that isn't too confusing to users to look at without relying on JSON, then sure.
Right.
I mean, my really basic assumption in this case was that the default case is text, and then we just do a dot to string, and
But
it's
how do you
up to
go,
the
for example, oh, you're saying, so how do you do comparison though? Like say you can do dot equals right on Java Lang object. So you can say it's not equal to the test data. But then if it's not equal, what you really want to do is show the user a diff. And you can't do that. I mean, you could do a string diff, but string diffs are very finicky to inconsequential changes in data.
yeah.
What I'm thinking is that if we base our ability to render this into JSON or whatever on Zio schema, then suddenly we have access to the structure of this data. And with that structure, we can do a diff. And so if your actual result does not match your golden data, we can say didn't match because of this reason. Another thing that could be nice is imagine you're submitting a pull request, and your pull request includes updates to golden data. Then imagine a different developer who's reading that pull request. He sees that you're actually changing some golden data, and he wants a good reason why. If he's able to see that diff on GitHub, and that diff makes sense, and it like alerts him to the line of the JSON that changed, then he's going to have a much better experience reviewing that pull request. So I think that that argues for we take this information, we render it in a structured way, but also in a structured way that's going to be friendly for text-based differs that are going to be used in pull requests, which means pretty printed JSON or pretty printed YAML or something like that. It, and that would be friendlier than toString. Right? toString is one big long line that just wraps around and around and around, and there's going to be some difference there somewhere, but GitHub is not going to show you what that is. So
Yeah.
and also, even if you could see what it is, it's not very easy to comprehend large amounts of data if they're two-stringed versus if they're pretty printed in a structured way. So I think what I've talked myself into, if you agree, and this is your library, so we can do whatever you like, but what I've talked myself into is that if we use ZO schema, we will be able to offer some pretty compelling benefits without having to implement a lot of things ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just, I don't know,
Yeah,
maybe lazy or something like that. But I was assuming that people would take care of pretty printing themselves because they don't want to do that to their reviewers anyways.
yeah,
But if we can do better, then that's great, of course. And
that's great.
yeah, my first thought
Okay,
was just JSON because that tends to work, but Zio schema
yes.
will definitely be even better.
Okay, fantastic. So let's go back to your little snippet of code. Yeah, that's right. Um, Nabil, is it, who's saying that ZeoTest had issues initially in that it's like expected this but found this, and it's like when it prints out expected it shows you 100 lines, and then found it shows you another 100 lines, and it wasn't until we implemented diffing that those types of error messages became comprehensible and more actionable. I think the same thing applies here. Diffing
Yeah, for
here
sure.
will go a long way. Sensible, structured diffing will go a long way to helping make these errors sensible, especially because, like you say, oftentimes this data is generated, so it tends to be much bigger than something that a developer would code by hand.
Mm.
Okay, so a user calls approval test, and then we don't need .text per se, um, but we do need the file name. Should this be a constructor on approval test?
Maybe, maybe not.
Do we even need do we even need that a, an object called approval test? Is that even necessary? Or could we get by with just a function called, assert, I don't know what it would be called, but like assert something, right? What would that function be called if it were an assert? Assert golden, and then you feed it the file name and then the entity. And then that returns you a test result. Tushar asks, could the expected be auto-generated the first time? I think we should do that. I think we should automatically generate the golden data the first time. So you run it through, and I don't know if it fails or it succeeds, but in any case, it should generate the golden data and save it. And then you run it again, and it should definitely succeed with the golden data, assuming your code's deterministic. All right, does this sort of API make sense? Can we implement this? Assume here that assert golden takes the resource name in the first parameter and then some value of type A for which there's an implementation of the schema type class in ZeoSchema. Does this seem reasonable to you, Baldwin?
Yes. I think so. I mean, I will have to fiddle around with it and then maybe.
Okay, so let's copy paste just one of these tests all the way up to the top though. So like all the way up to the object into our notes because we're going to show people how this library is used and this is going to motivate our actual coding. Yeah, and you can delete the approval test, right? Or sorry, you
Yes.
can delete line 22 and 23. Yeah, fantastic. And then maybe we let's give user dash text a extension just to, yeah, better communicate the idea that this is a file. Or maybe just dot data. That way we don't get into what's inside there. It's just data. I like that. And just call it maybe instead of example text, call it user golden data or user golden or something. I don't know, like that. We minimize the number of new concepts. So when a developer sees this, they're not naturally attracted to things that are different. Yeah. Example golden test. And maybe even call that golden user. You could if you wanted. No, because it's maybe golden user. It's really
Mm.
we don't know if it's a golden user. The first time we run it, we say, okay, this is a golden data that we're going to save. Next time we run it, well, then as you change the code, it has the potential to fail. Yeah, let's talk about that. I'm not sure about that though. I don't think we're going to fail because the golden file does not exist. I think we'll I think we will create the golden file because basically it doesn't exist, right? So there is no known prior good data. So I think the correct thing to do, it would be correct in 99% of the cases, is to create that file with the specified value used as the golden data. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the second time, subsequent times, when you run the test, the value will be tested, yeah, with the golden file data. All right, this seems reasonable to me. And as a developer who's looking at this, I see a small amount of code. And if I know Zio test, I'm really only seeing one new thing, and that's assert golden. So instead of assert true, it's assert golden. That seems simple to me. I don't know if we could make this even simpler.
I mean, that's probably good enough for a first iteration, and
Yes,
then we see what
Tushar
happens.
says if there is a change, test should fail, and there could be a new set of snapshots generated that could be accepted or rejected. I think that's a great idea. So let's write that in another line, which is that if the test output is different, then yes, the test will fail, comma, but the failed test data or failed, I don't know how to describe that, I'm missing terminology here, will be written to a new file that can be used to update the golden file, written to a new file. Right. So this could be user dash golden dot data dot new. Right. It could be something like that. And then you could imagine or maybe have tooling at some point that will go through and let you compare and say, do I want to accept this or reject it? And if I accept it, it just clobbers the old file. If I reject it, it deletes the .new file. That could just be a simple command line application or maybe part of SBT or whatever um, build tool you're using that could just be baked in, or it could even be encoded in the Zio IntelliJ IDEA plugin, for example. All right, Nabil says, would you always run the test again if the file does not exist so you can not skip non-deterministic tests too easily? That's an interesting idea, which is that the first time you generate it, maybe you run it again just to make sure it's producing the same outputs. If it doesn't produce the same output, you warn the user and say, there's some non-determinism here.
Mm.
That would be easy to do at some point.
I mean, if we follow the rule we just written down, then the logical thing to do would be to write it as .new anyway, and
Yeah,
then you would just remove the .new, and then it's up to you to run it again.
right. Maybe that could be a feature addition,
Mm.
which we think about at some point. Okay, but not required for the minimum viable product. An anonymous attendee asked, how is this different than snapshot testing? It's not, is it?
It's
Snapshot
not.
testing is just a different name for this, I
Yeah,
think.
I found snapshot testing is used in front-end land a lot, and golden testing or approval testing, or there was even another name I encountered, but I don't remember right now.
There's so many names because they were independently invented by different types of engineers at different periods in history. Snapshot
Hmm.
testing sounds like a front end thing, like HTML and GIFs. And I remember the days of testing browsers. Not fun. Very fragile. Those types of snapshot tests are
Imagine.
very fragile. Okay, so I think this is a reasonable start at a README. We've sold the library, we've told them why they should care, and all of these pain points that we mentioned here should help shape the user interface, which we've already developed, just a single assert golden here, as well as the actual implementation. I think we are ready to begin coding.
Maybe
Do you
before
have
we dive into that, one quick question, and that is, you even briefly touched on it in the beginning. There was some attempt at one point in implementing something like that, and
yes,
it can actually be found on the COJSON Golden.
yes,
And I mean, I don't want to bash anyone's library, but I think it's sort of in its early stage maybe, and it
yes,
makes some different assumptions than I would do. And
yeah.
so my question would be, should that just be independent, or should these libraries eventually merge? Or
I think if that's not being actively developed, we would prefer this one versus that one, because
okay,
this one we're what we're trying to do, and one of the ways I hope I'm helping is like pushing this down a direction that feels like it's a part of Zio. Zio has a certain, like most open source frameworks, it has a certain feel to it and certain conventions. And what I'm trying to do is to get us to the point where if this were in Zio, you wouldn't be confused or surprised. You'd just be like, of course this is in Zio, right? So basically Zio idiomatic is the feel that I'm trying to help you develop. And I think that we're almost there. And I have not taken a look at this golden testing for JSON in Zio JSON, but it could be specialized to JSON. And in any case, it's probably not going to be as quite as Zio idiomatic as what we came up with today.
but the library is
Yeah, this is general
relatively
purpose.
the
It's not
library is
just
relatively
JSON.
small, and it it always expects to be able to generate a random set of data. So it
Ah,
uses Magnolia. So it's actually pretty fancy in that sense, and maybe that's
yes,
some inspiration we could actually uh, take for this library as well.
yeah.
But um, yeah, it assumes that it can always generate the data for you rather than getting some data from the user.
Interesting. So it tries to generate data for you. That's
But I
interesting.
think that may be something for the second iteration again.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so shall we sketch out? I don't know if you have a working development environment set up with all the right
Yeah, that
dependencies.
should
You do?
hopefully
Yeah.
work. Let's see if I'm not lying.
And let's put this in the package zio.test.
Mm.
That's correct, right? Yeah, perfect.
So would you have it in co.test or co.s.golden?
Zio test package, but what we can do is we can create an object in there called golden. Oops. Yeah. We can have an object inside this called golden. I would even do lowercase. Sorry, yeah, lowercase g2. Basically just an ordinary object inside here. So how you would import this, in fact, let's go back to our example. We didn't even add the import, but that's good to have in the README. It's just import, yeah, zio.test.golden._, or maybe just assert golden, if that's really the only thing we have in there. So you import that, and then by the way, we should add the spec part later. Don't need to do that now, but just to make this a self-contained example that
Yeah,
a user
makes
could,
sense.
because it's going to be small. It's only going to be 10 lines. So it's small enough that we would rather not elide those details and give them something they can copy paste into a file and execute and see how it works. Yeah. Okay. So inside this golden file, Nabil asks if it would make sense to have this lib extensible. I think we could think about that, but I think we're at the point where we should just implement something and see the drawbacks that it has and see what problems we ran into when we're implementing it, and then test it with some real values and see what the developer experience is end to end. All right, so inside object golden, we're going to have a def assert golden, which is going to be polymorphic, so it's going to take a type parameter. And we need to add a context bound to that A because you can't assert for any A. It has to be an A that has an implementation of ZIO schema. So actually you'll use single colon because we're not going to require subtyping. Or if you prefer, you could just have a using clause since you're coding this in Scala 3. Depends on which one you prefer, if you like context bounds or using clauses.
Let's be modern here.
Okay. So using schema, lowercase schema, of type schema of A. That way we have a handle onto it and we can refer to it.
So then we don't need
All
this
right.
one.
Yeah, delete that context bound. Don't need it there. Fantastic. All right. So the purpose of assert golden then is to first check to see if the file exists. Oh no, that's not the first thing. We can actually, is that the first thing we would do? I guess it could be. And actually, instead of returning a test result, how about we return a task of a test result? We are in ZIO world. And so if we're going to be doing things like interacting with file systems, we want to make sure we do that inside an effect. So that'll require importing ZIO.task.
I'm switching between IntelliJ and VS Code, and I don't recall
Huh,
the shortcuts. Sorry.
perfect. Okay, so now we would check to see if the file exists. And if it does exist, we'll do one thing. If it doesn't exist, we'll do something else. So you can check to see if it exists using Java. You is it Java util io or is it Java io? Java io.file. Yeah, you're gonna have to do new because
Would you use Java directly, or should we use Ionia?
you could see if Zio has. I would not add another library just for this because you're only going to be doing a couple things. So minimize dependencies. Yeah, and you might want to wrap this whole thing in task dot attempt because all of these can throw IO exceptions at least. Sorry, the whole function body you might want to
Yeah, sure.
wrap in task attempt.
The task attempt, not CO attempt.
Sorry, ZIO attempt. Different era. Task attempt did exist, but
Okay.
that was probably before your time. All right, so if the file exists,
Jesus, I'm not yet used to Scala 3.
Copilot is, then we need to load its contents. Let's just write pseudocode here as comments because we're not going to have enough time to finish this today. We're going to load its contents from the file name, right? From the file.
Mm-hmm.
So just write that down, load contents from file as the first step. And then the second step is compare with value, but we can't compare directly. Why? Because, I mean, we can do dot equals, I suppose. Maybe that's enough. So we compare with value using object equality, the dot equals method that's on every object in Java and Scala. And then, okay, next step is if it's equal, then open up, a new code block, right? We'll do a bunch of things, or maybe, yeah. If equal, maybe just say if equal, return test success, because that's true, isn't it? Yeah, because we're done at that point. But if it's not equal, we're not done. We actually have more work to do. Yep, we got to create the .new file using a value, and then we've got to compute a diff between the loaded value and the actual value, so the golden data. And then what do we do with that? I guess we embed that in our, yeah, in our test failure. Does that make sense? I miss any steps there?
Sounds reasonable so far.
Okay, so
So
let's
there
do
is one
pseudocode.
detail,
Go ahead.
um, and that is file name will probably be a relative file name. So we also need some kind of information on where
Yes,
that's supposed to live.
right.
And
And we're going to be probably requiring they store that in the resources directory. So it's going to be a resource path. We can form a
mm,
URI and try to load it using class loader. So
and
it's
then
not
it
going
would
to be, I guess it's not going to be a Java IO file because we're going to try to load this using the from resources. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's figure out the else branch. This is the branch where the file does not exist. So I think in this case we create, but it's not a .new file, right? It's the actual new file, or is it? You were
that's the
saying
question.
originally, if a file doesn't exist, we should create it. That way the user doesn't have to do any work.
That's right. And then would we still fail?
Ah, I wish we could warn.
Uh, I think I would
I
feel
don't
more
know.
easy to fail because otherwise, if the user accidentally uses it, does something different, then they may get like imagine in the pull request you change the file name,
Yeah,
then CI will always let that test pass.
yeah,
So
right.
maybe
The only concern I have with that is, will ZeoTest run all of them, even if there's one failure? I think it will,
sure.
because if you created 100 new golden tests, you would want 100 files to be created in a single run. You wouldn't want to have to run the suite, get to your first failure, have it create that one file, and then have to run it 99 more times. But I
Yeah,
think you'll get
that's true.
all failures in ZeoTest, which means we should be able to fail without impacting the creation of these values. And then the next time you run it, it will succeed
Mm.
if that's what you want.
I think that would make sense. Maybe if we get some feedback on that behavior, then we can still
Any
change.
feedback from folks on that? The first time you run this, the file does not exist. Do you want your test to succeed silently, creating that file? You're going to see evidence of it because there's going to be a new file you have to add to Git, but it's not going to be very visible. And also, like Baldwin says, if you forgot to check in your file, then CI would succeed, right? If you forgot to do a git add and you push this, CI would succeed even without the master data. So I think that's the strongest argument for saying it should fail.
I mean, maybe if if both use cases are valid, then we could have some kind of test aspect fail if
Yeah,
not,
we
or
could modify
succeed
the
if not
behavior
exist.
with a test aspect. Yeah. All right. So I think this is a good first start. So where to from here? Well, what I would suggest is if you have the time, we can obviously work on this in a future session. But if you do have the time, what I would suggest is go ahead and implement these steps
Hmm.
and see if you can get this working. And then in our next session together, we're going to use this from the perspective of a user. We're going to walk through every step and see what it looks like. And then also, I think the trickiest part will be computing the diff. If you don't get to that between now and the next session, that's fine. We can take a look at that. I have a feeling that it might be easiest to do that in Zio schema. I think there actually is diffing machinery already in Zio schema that we can use. And if so, that could make that a really easy solve problem. If it doesn't exist, though, that's likely to be the most challenging part of this problem, and we could work on that together in the next one. But also, we need to do end to end. What does this look like and feel like from the perspective of a user? Is this good? Is this a good user experience or not?
Hmm. Sounds like a plan. So I have my homework and can give that a crack.
All right, fantastic. And then Nabil wants to grab me for 10 minutes. Let me check. I could probably do that. 10 minutes, but then I hard stop. I've dinner to attend to. Thank you so much, Baldwin, for bringing your ideas. I think both of these are great ideas, and I'm excited to see ZO Golden testing in operation in the near-term future.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, and yeah,
Absolutely. See you
we'll
soon,
be in
I hope.
touch.
Maybe
Yeah,
next
yeah,
week,
for sure.
next Friday. Okay. All right, Nabil, I'm going to put you on, and you had a question.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Um,
Yes,
I
welcome.
just start straight ahead, don't waste time. So,
Yes, dive in.
you remember when we were talking about the codec stuff and how to encode the errors in a user-friendly way? In my
Yes.
first attempt, I also tried to do some logging, right? And I was also talking about that actually, the same kind of problem exists on the side of the um, low-level API as well, when it comes to errors that are uh, encountered during the internals interaction with netting. Because then what we do is like we fail fast, we create a response, and the user has basically no option to tap into this error behavior.
Yeah.
And I thought, actually, there are good reasons why we do that. A lot of them because it's more efficient, but also uh, sometimes because of the structure, it makes it easier. And I thought, like, if we wanted to give the user an option to tap into that before creating the response, that would be probably a lot of work to do, a lot of restructuring. The same if we would somehow don't do that by default, or have an option to turn this off and then propagate the error up, which would probably also be a lot of work. And then I thought, like, maybe there's an easier solution, because nobody actually complained that we do create a default error response. They complain about they cannot change it, or when they want to change it, they don't have the original source of the error, so they cannot change it in the way they want.
Yeah.
So my thought was to not change everything up. Could we not just attach this information so that the user could get it? And then I thought, like, yeah, okay, we have this response type, right? But this response type that is used there is actually something internal for us that is not directly going to some netty or some framework, right? And we could technically put in whatever we want there. And would it maybe make sense to have the option to attach to a response some kind of cause? Would this have any problem, or would this maybe solve all these problems by saying, hey, you know what? If there's a cause on the response that is, some maybe just an option of a throwable or something like that, right? Then you can tap into the actual error. You can do whatever you want. You can just tap and lock. You could take it and remap the response to something that you like, and I think that would give the users exactly the things they are asking for. But I thought myself, like, yeah, maybe this works, maybe not, and that I would like to talk about this with you.
Yeah. So I think the problem with that is it feels to me like it's a little bit of a hack. Having a HTTP response data type with an attached optional throwable means that you have increased the number of illegal states which can be represented in that data type. Because what does it mean if you have a response with a status code of 200 and with a content of JSON, well-formed JSON, and also a cause attached? Because the cause being attached implies failure. It almost implies catastrophic failure, almost like internal server error type failure. Whereas the other information in the response would imply success. So that's why I like, basically there is no natural mapping of that type of response with the augmented cause to a real HTTP response. You've created something bigger for the purpose of threading information in the program. Right? You added a little slot here you could stuff something in to carry around. But in adding that slot, like the meaning of a response is no longer clear. The meaning of a response right now is something that can be literally translated to an HTTP response and also reconstructed from an HTTP response without loss of any information. And that key property of sort of our response being isomorphic to a real HTTP response is very valuable. The moment you add something that doesn't really belong in that domain, you're not going to be able to do the isomorphism anymore. You can go one way, but not the other way. And then you run into the question of what do all these new states mean? I don't think you can answer those questions in a satisfactory way, not in a way that really gives a precise meaning to everything. So I think it would be a fast path to solving the problem, but it's probably not the right solution. It's probably
But what do you think about so I understand why you don't want to put this in the response type, right?
Yes.
But is there maybe another technique that we could use that probably would do the same thing, right? So that we
instead
don't
of using response, either response throwable, right? That's precise because you're saying either you have a response
yeah,
or you don't, and it's a throwable.
yes, something like that. I mean, actually, what I think always do with this errors is we just have this response dot failure or something like this dot error. We put in a throwable and then return it into something, right?
Yes.
Maybe it's just the right thing to not just do it in all these internal places, but do it later. I don't know. And then gives the user the opportunity to tap in. Or alternatively, I don't know, put some information somewhere that is not directly inside the response that preserves the cause, right? That is also not too crazy, right? But something that user could tap in. Yeah, like Baldwin said, maybe put it in some kind of fiber ref or something like that. I don't know,
See, in many of the places, you can already call catch all error cause or tap all error cause, right? A handler, you can do that. In many places where your return value or your error value is a response, there still is an underlying cause that you can tap into. Right. So I think it would be very confusing if, in addition to that cause, there is another cause in the response. Right. It starts to pollute the model and it becomes very unclear what the meaning of these two different causes is.
Yes and no. We have exactly the other way around the problem because you have this tap error cause, but it doesn't tap all causes.
Maybe we should solve that problem. Like maybe we should solve the problem of if you want to handle a codec error, the way you should handle that is by calling tap error cause.
It's not only the codec error, right? I think the bigger issue is like that these internal netty errors, they getting transformed into a response before the user has any chance to look into them or later on to get
Sure.
to
So maybe that's the problem. Maybe the answer is HTTP codec errors should be fatal errors at that level, right? They should be in the cause. They should not be converted to responses in endpoint.
And then the same in the Netty server handler when Netty says like, I don't know, the response or the request is too large or something like that.
Well, that's a trickier handling errors from inside Netty is much trickier because you almost need to have your request handler and then like a catastrophic Netty error handler because your request handler assumes that it's going to get a request. But a lot of Netty errors occur before you actually have a request. So you can't fit that into a handler without adding an extra sort of catastrophic error handler. And one earlier version of Zio HTTP did experiment with that, but it was not a success. In my opinion, it was a failed experiment. It didn't compose together well, didn't feel right. It was awkward and ill-defined, and it led to some bugs. So we abandoned that, and it's much cleaner now. But it does lead to the problem of your handlers cannot handle Netty errors. It needs to be something at a higher level. It could be an HTTP app. An HTTP app could potentially handle Netty errors.
Yeah.
All right. So
I
Let's
think that's maybe one of the biggest problems that don't have an answer that is left in Zero HTTP that needs to be solved before like a final release.
I don't think we need to hold up a release for that because I think most likely whatever we come up with will be backward compatible.
Maybe, but
Like,
do you want to
handle
expose?
errors, handle errors on HTTP app.
I understand
Handle netty
this.
errors or something.
I understand this, right? But my question is more like, would you like, from a user perspective, right?
Yeah.
To get something, even though it might be fixed and the API doesn't change,
Yes.
that does something confusing, like you say, handle all error cause, right? And then it doesn't.
Yes.
And then I don't think I would like to tell users that is like a product that I feel good to ship with, and therefore say this is the final release.
Yeah. So the issue is I'm just not sure that there's a place to have a handle all error cause that handles handler errors as well as net errors. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but we could certainly take a look at that. I
I
think
don't.
though that should be placed on the back burner, and we should focus on, is there a way to take codec errors and
Yeah.
keep them as a cause error for longer rather than prematurely converting them to responses? Does that make sense? Maybe you could poke around between this week and next week and just do a little investigation. And then next week, we can just dive right in there and see if there's a way to keep the codec errors submerged so that later on, when you have your handler or you have your route, you can handle things at that level, the codec errors.
I guess actually when you say like put them into the defect channel of Zio, right? I think that's not very hard to do that. Like, is it, as long as it's not in the typed one, right? You don't see it in the typed things, and if it
You
would be
might run
fatal
into
later on,
problems, and one of the things I'm just thinking about is maybe the reason it is converted to a response now is just because it's easier. You have information on the endpoint. So maybe you can do a better job with error generation. But I think that's solvable because you can just embed the endpoint or whatever details you need from the endpoint into the codec error.
yeah, actually, no, we don't do something like this. I know
It's super
how
dumb.
this looks
Okay.
like. It's
All right.
just like, as I said, response dot from
Yes.
failure or something. It gets a
So maybe
throwable
prototype
and
that. Maybe prototype that, and we can take a look at that in the next session.
okay.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Nabil. Nice work, and I
Thank
will
you.
see you next week. Have a great week,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.